tools. So we have the legal tools and also the planning tools. What are available to also implement adoption, and then what other tools and strategies are available to protect neighborhoods. So these may not involve formal historic designation, but what about conservation areas or design guidelines or overlay districts or form-based codes or other ways, and we'll talk about those kinds of things as well. All right, so I'll turn it over. Do we have Ken? Okay, hi Ken.
Hi, can you all hear me and see me? I'm not seeing myself, so I don't know if I'm up on the screen. Hello?
I can hear you.
Great, hi Nori. Well, so great. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, so I'll just go ahead. So it's a great pleasure to be joining all of you from historic City Hall in Los Angeles. And I know I was seeing all of you in beautiful historic Balboa Park in San Diego, and sorry I can't be with you in person. I wanted to kind of set the scene today by talking a bit about historic districts in Los Angeles, some of our processes for designating and identifying historic districts, what we call historic preservation overlay zones, and our citywide historic resource survey, Survey LA. So to begin, historic preservation overlay zones in Los Angeles. We call them HPOZs here in LA. We have, I think, a bureaucratic acronym for everything. And in Los Angeles, what you generically probably refer to as historic districts are historic preservation overlay zones, or HPOZs. That does convey that these are part of our zoning code in Los Angeles and is an overlay on the base zoning throughout Los Angeles. And our historic districts, like most around the country, conduct reviews of, design reviews of historic buildings, contributing and non-contributing structures within our district. The review is limited to the exterior of our historic resources within the district without interior review. This is a map that shows you the growth of our HPOZ program around the city and some of the challenges that we're facing. We believe we're the second largest historic district program in the country, second only to New York, with about 21,000 properties encompassed in our 35 HPOZs across the city. And as you can see on the map, the HPOZs are heavily concentrated in the central city area, but we have HPOZs throughout the city. The north end of the map is our San Fernando Valley, and we have 3 in the valley, including a post-World War II district from the 1960s, and a couple down the lower end of the map in our Harbor district. A tremendous geographic and demographic diversity of these historic districts across the city, both among all of them and within many of our districts as well, great diversity. And the way that these are initiated is through city council action. City council members introduce motions to initiate the process. So it is, and we'll talk about this, both kind of a bottom-up and top-down process in getting this started. This is zooming in a little bit on just one area of the city, some of our highest concentration of HPOZs in the central city area, within a few miles of downtown, some of our Wilshire corridor districts and the greater West Adams area extending across our 10 freeway corridor along the lower portion of this map in the central city area. It has some of the highest concentrations of HPOZs. And here's a list of, for those of you that know LA, again, some of the diversity of the districts that are included among the 35 in Los Angeles. And this gives you a sense as well of some of the architectural, some of the stylistic and even topographical diversity of some of the HPOZs, ranging from our some of our post-war neighborhoods. We have 2 post-World War II districts, the Gregory Ain, Mar Vista tract, and the Balboa Highlands tract, and a neighborhood like Whitley Heights on the upper right in our hillside area of Hollywood. One thing that makes our system in LA a bit unique, most cities have a single historic preservation commission. We don't do that in Los Angeles, in part because of the size of the city. We do have a citywide commission, our Cultural Heritage Commission, but our sheer size probably makes that unworkable, looking at 35 districts and 21,000 properties. We're a city of 470 square miles as well, and residents feel very disconnected from downtown and LA City Hall. And so from the very beginning of our HPOZ ordinance back in 1979, when this was created, it was created with a system of HPOZ boards, 5-member volunteer boards that assist the city in reviewing projects. So in a sense, we don't have one commission. We at this point have really 36 historic preservation commissions, which is a challenge in terms of providing training and consistency. But on the positive side, it does bring our historic preservation program into the neighborhood and continues the legacy of this really being a grassroots program. We're trying to address some of the challenges of the size of this program, though, by streamlining the HPOZ board process. We didn't expect we would have 35 HPOZ boards when that ordinance was created. And so we've just gotten the City Council to approve a set of ordinance amendments that allow us to combine multiple HPOZs under a single HPOZ board. It would be 7-member boards, and we will be in the coming months leaving some of our HPOZs with standalone boards, but in some cases 2 or 3 HPOZs that are geographically contiguous or nearby, maybe sharing a single HPOZ board so that we can make it a more manageable number of somewhere probably between 20 and 25 HPOZ boards ultimately. Another hallmark of our program is, and I heard part of Kevin Johnson's discussion about Pasadena's approach to this, we have separate HPOZ preservation plans for each of our designated districts. We feel this is very important, and we've taken steps in recent years to ensure consistency and somewhat some standardization among the various preservation plans across the city. But we do tailor the design guidelines to the specific local preferences as well as architectural styles found in each neighborhood. And these are some of the components that you see in all of our preservation plans, and it includes a summary of some of our HPOZ procedures, as well as giving residents and all stakeholders in the process a sense of the history and significance of the area by summarizing our historic context statement and historic resource survey findings. And then the heart of the preservation plan are tailored design guidelines that address everything from rehabilitation to additions, infill, and even public realm and new construction and commercial use commercial districts. I think it's important we can get more into this in the discussion to talk about outreach in the historic district process. This is really key to the adoption of new districts across the city. As I mentioned, while the districts are initiated as a top-down effort typically by the City Council, their success or failure in the adoption process is really a function of how the neighborhood is organized and the door-to-door campaigning that takes place to convince residents that a historic district would be a benefit to the neighborhood and to address misconceptions and misinformation that typically circulates. Here's a great effort that was done by the Windsor Village neighborhood with radio flyer wagons to literally go door to door and answer questions, and many neighborhoods have left door hangers in kind of a door-to-door campaign. Our office partners with those efforts. We are not advocates. Ultimately, we are providing information to all residents as a neutral party in the process, but certainly we are providing information and resources that many of those grassroots organizations are able to draw upon in their own advocacy. Nevertheless, as I'm sure is true in most of your communities, historic district formation is not without opposition and controversy in Los Angeles. Here's an example of a very contentious adoption process we had last year for the Miracle Mile HPOZ, a neighborhood of mix of single family and multifamily properties, about 1,200 properties in all. And there was a strong community-based organization that was in support, but a late-breaking in the last few months of this process, late-breaking group of opponents that were driven by property rights concerns. Many multifamily apartment owners were particularly concerned about the proposed HPOZ. This one was ultimately adopted after many, many community meetings and well-attended discussions facilitated by our office and the city council member of the district, with often hundreds participating. Another one going through a similar process, though, the Holmby Westwood HPOZ near UCLA, did not make it, and the opposition there was so strong around property rights concerns that it is has been put on hold and may not go forward at all at this point. So to kind of bring this together with historic resource surveys, Los Angeles, as many of you know, has just completed our first systematic program to identify historic resources in Los Angeles. This was supported by the Getty. The Getty Foundation provided a matching grant to the city. The Getty Conservation Institute provided ongoing technical assistance. And our goal of Survey LA was to use this information as a planning tool. And I'll get more into that in a moment, and Nori will be building on this in his comments. And this is one of the largest and most ambitious programs of its type. We are now loading all the data from Survey LA and Survey LA findings into a new inventory, Historic Places LA, referred to as HPLA, another partnership between the city and the Getty to provide a single online inventory of all this information. The data management, the data loading of this is still ongoing, so not all the data is quite yet in the system. This is a screenshot of one area of the city, of some of the highest concentration of historic resources in the Wilshire community plan area, a few miles from downtown. But Survey LA has identified dozens and dozens of historic districts across the city that would be eligible. We are not designating, but these are eligible for historic designation. This gives you a view of some of the diversity of districts that Survey LA has found on top of our 35 HPOZs. And here's a couple of particular examples, several in the Venice community near Venice Beach, including a couple of what we call walk street neighborhoods that are quite unique to Venice in Los Angeles and have early 20th century bungalows in many cases. Other districts that were identified for their ethnic history, ethnic and cultural associations, such as this one, the Crenshaw-Sanon district near the West Adams Crenshaw district of Los Angeles, where the legacy of Japanese American residents in the 1950s and 60s is still very evident in some of the roof forms and landscaping, even though the demographics of that neighborhood have changed dramatically. But to give you a sense of our challenge in Los Angeles, this is a zoomed in map of the Wilshire Community Plan area once again. And in yellow, you see the designated HPOZs. Several of them include some of our largest, Hancock Park and Windsor Square toward the center. The pink are eligible historic districts that have been identified by Survey LA. I should say no other area of the city has anything close to this type of concentration. And there are many community plan areas of the city that have little or no historic districts identified. But if you look at this area, we see several, a large number of potential historic districts on top of the already designated districts. We also identify what we call planning districts in the blue, which Nori can speak to as well. These are neighborhoods that do not have the historic integrity, the cohesiveness of character to be a historic district, but they are identified to guide our planners that they have unique planning characteristics that are worthy of consideration in our local planning process and coming up with other land use strategies to address the unique character of those areas. So to speak and kind of wrap up about Survey LA and its interaction with planning, it's important to point out, first of all, that survey assessments through Survey LA or other assessments are not tantamount to historic designation. We are not treating these properties as HPOZs or these districts as HPOZs. The intention is to use Survey LA as a planning tool to guide our review of individual projects throughout the city, to guide our long-range planning efforts around the city. But it's important to point out that in most areas of Los Angeles, day-to-day permits, including permits for alteration or even demolition, and we may not have time to get into the subtleties of Sequa, the California Environmental Quality Act, most day-to-day permits do not trigger review under Sequa in the city of Los Angeles. However, we are using the survey information when we have a project that is subject to Sequa, California Environmental Quality Act, if it involves a discretionary action, something that requires a planning approval through a public hearing process or public review process. Survey LA's information comes into play on those discretionary actions in the city. But by and large, our intention with Survey LA has been to use it to shape long-range plans such as this one, the West Adams Baldwin Hills Leimert Community Plan update that has just been adopted by our City Council. Our goal is to update all 35 of our community plans in the city over the next 6 years, and we're updating our general plan elements as well. And the Survey LA information is key to informing those long-range plans. To informing, unfortunately, our disaster preparedness in the city. We know that the big one is coming at some point, And we need to understand what and where our historic resources are to be able to be prepared in the aftermath of an earthquake or other natural disaster to make some difficult decisions. And then, as a lead into Nori's discussion, our work on the new zoning code in Los Angeles, Recode LA, updating a very outmoded 1946 zoning code with new zoning tools, and the survey information and some of the typologies and data in Survey LA is informing how we develop more contextual zoning that is more responsive to concerns at the local community level, as well as local history and architecture. So that is a broad overview. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to the discussion. We have an illustrious panel, and look forward to interacting with all of you.
To divide the city into districts. It's almost always done through an overlay zone. You heard them, HPOZ is what Ken described them as. So it controls the visual changes, but it doesn't usually control use. But one of the ways that, using the fact that it's part of the zoning ordinance, is that you can give some additional flexibility in use through district designation or landmark designation. So that can be an important aspect of having a district designation, that you can have a wider range of uses than you otherwise were, if necessary, to preserve the structure. Both cities and counties have authority to, this is, there we go. And I thought it was interesting to look at the enabling legislation in California. Counties are allowed to designate places and sites that includes districts. And it's very interesting that you can have special conditions that include the control of the appearance of neighboring private property. So it's almost asking to have district regulations where you look not just at individual structures, but you look at the whole suite of structures and combined impacts. Cities don't have exactly the same enabling legislation, but it also provides for places, buildings, and allows conditions that consider changes to neighboring properties, private properties that can be seen publicly. And then just a couple of items that come up. We've just been in the middle of a designation, some designation issues and revisions to an historic ordinance in Orange County, and these again sometimes get forgotten. Owner consent is not required by law. Many local ordinances have an owner consent provision, which I actually think is inconsistent with the nature of designation as zoning, because you typically don't ask someone if they would like to be zoned. You typically zone based on the land, not the interest of the owners, unless there's an application. But it is frequently, it's part of the National Register since I think it was the 1970s. There was the Colcord building in Oklahoma City. The California Register and a lot of cities have it, but because of Sequa, the fact that you haven't consented doesn't prevent a building from being, or district from being considered historic if it's found to be eligible. Property rights. Property rights are, under the law, not taken by designation. That's, we just heard that in Pasadena, the surveys show that designation usually frequently increases property values. And according to the National Trust studies, that's pretty standard across the country, that it increases values. Property rights are virtually never taken by the act of designation. It is possible that they can be taken or eliminated in a permit situation, but that's quite different from designation. So when someone comes up and says, this designation ordinance is going to take my property rights, they may be speaking from the heart emotionally, but they're not speaking under Fifth Amendment inverse condemnation law. And then finally, not all designation is regulatory. There are some communities where, in essence, designation is honorary, primarily for the purpose of allowing people to get Mills Act contracts so that the local government elects to identify historic areas, but not to regulate them. Although once you've designated an area, you do wind up in Sequa procedures. Where they are regulatory, there are two aspects to it. One is that it is intended to control changes to the exterior of contributing buildings. And then the second piece, which is very important, is it also controls new construction to ensure that it's compatible. And I don't know if Wayne will be talking about that, but I know that that is an area of particular interest to Noring. Okay. Cities can do a lot of things to streamline adoption of districts. It doesn't need to be what I would call a Cadillac designation process. I was actually thinking, I grew up, it was a Cadillac or a Ford. I was thinking, well, maybe it's not a Cadillac and a Ford anymore. Maybe it's a Mercedes and a smart car. But you can actually have a smart car designation. And one of the things that is possible to do is to if there are National Register historic districts, they would typically then qualify for the California Register, and they can be, those can be adopted by reference. And they define the district as having a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, united historically or aesthetically by plan or by physical development. And that packs a lot of information about what can make a district. A district can be based on who the architect is. It can be based on a sort of unity of, this is in the city of Orange has, I think, the largest residential craftsman district, National Register district in the country, and that's based on architectural similarities. It can be based on weather. One of the things I think about sometimes is Irvine is one of the best known planned communities in the United States. Its planning structure could make it part of a district. And, you know, they pioneered the no lot line developments and the C developments and Z developments. And those can be things that are identified in the district. But what does have to happen is that the significance of the district needs to be identified, types of features that are important to the district, geographical boundaries, and you need to identify some integrity in the district. A lot of times you'll hear, we wanted to have at least 50% of the buildings in the district to be contributors to the district. There isn't a precise percentage, but the idea is the boundaries should reflect the actual extent, the geographic extent. I'm also a believer that the boundaries of a district should be visual, give visual notice. There are sometimes I've seen districts where it's a sort of intellectual construct rather than a visual boundary. So I think it's very helpful to think in terms of, if I'm driving down the street, am I aware that I'm entering into a different sort of place with some unity? Discontiguous districts are also possible. There are bridge districts. There can be districts organized around a particular architect, and I think we don't do enough with discontiguous districts, which somewhat inconsistent with the idea that it should be visually unified, but you can tell when you're going through an area that has a lot of historic bridges, even if between the bridges it's not as unified. Some of the examples: downtown business districts, the Chicago Loop is a wonderful example. Campuses, residential areas, bridges. Campuses are getting a lot of attention now as we're going through second and third rounds of revisions to the great post-war California campuses. And then, as I said, you do need consent to be on the National Register, but an eligibility determination is sufficient for Sequa and would ordinarily be sufficient if a city wanted to rely on the district documentation for a district that was identified as eligible. California Register also allows districts somewhat different criteria, but I thought it was very interesting that although they use the same, California uses the same criteria for districts as it does for individual landmarks. If you go on their website, they have some very interesting approaches to districts. They talk about the historic context statements, which can be significant for an individual landmark, but also lay the groundwork for the district, where you identify themes, geographic areas, and periods of significance. Historic resources surveys, which Ken just described through Survey LA, a wonderful way of identifying districts. And then the specific advice on the website is that whenever there's any sort of surveying going on, the public agency should consider the possibility that there's a district there. And then, of course, the status codes that are used by OHP have special status codes for contributors and for individual landmarks or landmarks that are also contributors. So the status codes allow a lot of information to be collected that can be used for district designation. And then I wanted to talk a bit about adopting local criteria and procedures. Although we tend to think in terms of the National Register or the California Register criteria, it is, most cities want to designate districts or structures that are important in their own local history. Some places are lucky enough to have nationally significant areas, but for cities, being able to claim their own history, regardless of whether it's of state or national significance, that is frequently the purpose of the local landmark ordinance. the decision to designate is one that it's a sort of hybrid of a policy decision and an individual adjudicatory decision. But one of the things I wanted to talk about in the difference between the Cadillac and the smart car is the level of proof that is required. Because I think cities have a lot of leeway and flexibility in the amount of information that they will require in advance before a district is designated, and the amount of information that can be collected from individual property owners as projects are proposed. So the general idea is that when you designate a district, the public agency needs to have substantial evidence to support the boundaries, the identification of contributors or non-contributors, but it does not need to know everything about everything. And I think that can be very important because I know, for instance, San Diego is looking at a tremendous time period and expenditure of funds in what appears to be an effort to know everything about everything in historic districts. Ken talked about the fact that they have done Survey LA, a multi-million-dollar effort, and they still aren't to the place where they can actually process individual districts. So they have a lot of information. It does need to be collected, but it doesn't need to be, it can be collected at a level of detail appropriate for that particular district. One of the things I'm interested in the past, a lot of districts have been identified with volunteers, and you can organize volunteers to take information and to do surveys and to make proposals. On a burden of proof, the burden of proof in general, if someone disagrees with a determination about whether their building is contributing or non-contributing, there should be a procedure that is set up at the local agency, but it can be done in the context after the designation has occurred to allow individual properties to say, at the zoning level, you made the decision, but you didn't have this kind of detailed information. And Sequa actually includes a procedure or a reference to a procedure for allowing property owners to unclassify them, undesignate themselves during the Sequa process. So it is important to identify, as I said, the boundaries, what the significant character-defining features are, what the contributors are, and character-defining features can be a lot of different things. They're primarily going to be architecture, but one of the things we're going to be talking about later this afternoon is that things like density or road design or pedestrian access can also be character-defining features. And those should be identified at the time of the designation, even if additional work might need to be done at some point. Just a couple of items. The authority, the designation needs to be adopted by ordinance. The legislative body typically would do that designation, but if there's a situation where the planning commission is delegated authority for certain kinds of rezonings, it's possible for the planning commission to do it. If there's an historic resources board, it typically makes a recommendation either to the Planning Commission or to the legislative body. And then finally, Sequa issues. And I want to clarify that designation is not a Sequa process. Designation identifies whether something is historic or not and the reasons that it's historic. What Sequa says is that historic resources are environmental resources, so that the historic resources are part of the environment. And that's why when something's determined eligible, it can still be considered part of the environment if the only reason it hasn't been designated is because the owner hasn't consented. The Sequa applies to discretionary decisions adversely affecting historic resources. So you look at what the historic resource is, you decide whether the proposed discretionary proposal is going to adversely affect the things that make that significant. A district itself may be the historic resource. And I actually think that's something that really public agencies need to look at. The idea that the historic resource is the district and that the contributors are not themselves individual historic resources, but they are part of what makes the historic district significant. They obviously contributed to it. That's one of the approaches that we took up in the Mare Island area. And what that does is it allows you to adopt the kind of design and permitting regulations that Wayne and Nori, I think, are going to be talking about that ensure the continued integrity of the historic district, but it doesn't put you in a situation where every single change to a contributing structure winds up triggering an EIR. It also gives you much more flexibility in how you're going to interpret the Secretary of Interior standards. And incidentally, the Secretary standards are not mandatory under Sequa. They are safe harbor, meaning if you comply with the Secretary standards, there is a presumption effectively that you have that you're not going to have an adverse impact. But it doesn't mean that's the only way to avoid adverse impacts. And the Secretary standards on districts are sometimes a little hard to, they're a little, I think the technical legal word is mushy. And so it can be very helpful to look. You can get information from the settings discussion in the Secretary standards, but I think it's helpful to remember that you're looking at the district and that the standards are safe harbor, not the only way to comply with Sequa. Eligibility for the California Register is essentially automatically a Sequa historic resource. And then finally, on the status of surveys, there's a sort of hot debate going on that a lot of communities have done surveys and the surveys were adopted. If surveys are formally adopted, they don't expire. There is, for the purposes of Sequa, a kind of weird situation where Sequa refers to the California Register, and there were some rather inarticulately drafted amendments to the California Register a while ago that say that an unadopted survey in order to be considered to adequately identify historic resources, has to be updated within the previous 5 years. So surveys are a kind of moving target at the moment. And I guess my position on that is that it is unlikely that a building that was historic in 1975 is going to be less historic today, if it's still standing. But it is certainly possible that, that buildings that weren't surveyed in 1975 will now qualify. So that's it.
Our next speaker is Wayne Donaldson.
Thank you so much. I'm going to leave some time for Nori to talk about that. We have tomorrow, of course, dealing with historic districts and the Secretary's Interior standards, and we'll have lots of graphics on that. I was asked to participate on this panel yesterday, so I don't have any collection of images and stuff, but I do want to give you some probably 30,000 foot view from both from state and in particular from a federal perspective, as well as kind of capture some of our more current events that we have. As you know, as you watch television with both Harvey and now Irma, are just disastrous types, and you just see what has blown through there. And of course, we have Jose right behind. It's interesting to note, though, that when Andrew came through in 1992, is that it created, especially for districts, a unique thing in terms of the treatment of historic properties, and it included a fourth category. And that fourth category was reconstruction. We did not have reconstruction in the treatment of historic properties before then. And it's because most of the Southern legislators said, we want to reconstruct our buildings that have fallen down, we've lost integrity from them, but we want to have them as contributors to our historic districts. And the pressure was so great at that time from Andrew that reconstruction was then born as part of the National Park Service treatment of historic properties. So, and I heard somebody mention John Merritt on there. Lori and I just about a week ago delivered to Debbie Howell in Pasadena 7 boxes of John's notes, his private notes. And I scanned them real quickly because Betty Merritt, John's wife, said that I'm scattered through there in some of my discussions I had with John. As you know, we kind of dragged him from his house into a real office building in Oakland so that CPF could become what CPF has become today. But I remember that John has always said to me, what does the community want to protect in terms of its heritage? And not to start listening to state and federal overviews and laws and all that. And he is always looking at that as being a planning tool. And I think when we heard, especially from Kelly and Kevin and others today, is that we're really talking about having this as a planning tool. To put it in perspective, in 1931, we had 1 historic district. Up until, and I'm not sure what's current right now, but about 2012, we had about 3,200 historic districts. Not that many historic districts, all in all, but we're having more and more. So what I would like to do is, by the way, does size matter under this administration? Yes, it does, but size also matters in historic districts. Virginia City Historic District has 14,750 acres. It's the largest geographical thing. To give you a clue, if you're looking at about 10,000 acres, that would be driving your car on one leg of a square for about 2.5 minutes. That would just be one leg. So pretty large, 600 and some odd, acres in a square mile. The largest in terms of resources, we heard that that Pasadena has one. It's Oh, what, 600 you said, maybe? Okay, well, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Amish country, has 13,411 contributing buildings in one district. So size, you can have it any that you want, but it's really kind of up to the community. So spinning off of these disastrous hurricanes and climate change that we've been having, and Ken did throw a slide up on when we're expecting the next big one. I wasn't too shocked, but you know, growing up in San Diego and going through the URM, the Unreinforced Masonry Code and everything else, and trying to save the buildings, I read in the UT yesterday about our infamous Rose Canyon fault, where it said that if erupted, it would be at about 7.3. Eureka was 7.2, which was very disastrous. But it said that it would kill 2,000 people, cause $40 billion worth of property damage, 200,000 buildings would be damaged, and 33,000 families would be displaced from a fault that runs from Oceanside down to downtown in the Gaslamp Corridor, the central of this. I'm thinking, oh man, people are going to start reading this and start freaking out as usual on this. But that's not to say that it cannot happen. So as a planning document then, as we try to deal with this, how can our historic buildings, especially since Tony Court, who's an old friend of mine and a structural engineer, said that probably all of our old concrete buildings are at risk. Well, that's pretty much every doggone building from 1930s to what we have now, with the exception of some steel buildings that we have. So I'm kind of looking at how we have been dealing with this from a federal level and looking at how this treats. So if I flash back to Northridge, which was one of our largest ones, and we had already enacted the law from our 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. If you remember, nobody was prepared. We did not have good plans on that. So John Merritt and I got a law passed under Governor Wilson that basically said before anything is torn down, and in particular in historic districts, because after Loma Prieta, Santa Cruz, thinking that it's going to get promised from a lot of money from FEMA to rebuild their buildings, decided to tear down all the old dilapidated buildings, much like we had in the Gaslamp Corridor, where the ground floor maybe had something going on, but all the upper floors were all vacant. A large problem with homeless and everything else, so they tore it down. It was our first historic district nationwide to be removed from the National Register of Historic Places because of the loss of integrity. So as we focus on how we're going to really look at this, one thing that came to us, because these programs will affect not only districts, but what we're looking at. In 2011, there was an inaction under the Obama administration on strong cities, strong communities, known as SC2 from the federal government. What this allowed is these particular legacy cities, and we're sort of blessed in San Diego since we're one of the largest of these cities, that we had a very good economy at this time. But these are sort of the legacy cities that we've heard about all over. And the legacy cities, because of the people leaving the cities, not having the workforce that's there, and all this time, like in Philadelphia and Detroit and these that you've heard about, all of a sudden then, these particular properties, and John, could we throw that up? Oh, it's already up there, okay. Make it a little bit larger. We, at the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation, Brad White, who is the past president of Preservation Action, and I were sitting in a room with the HUD representative, and we heard that HUD was then going to fund massive areas to be demolished because these were then vacant homes sitting there. And we thought, well, what the heck is this all about? So we asked some people to come and talk to us. One was Jay Williams, who is the mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, Brian Conway, who is the Michigan State Historic Preservation Officer, and Roy Yater, who has been with the National Trust for Historic Preservation for many, many years, to talk about what this impact was going to be. Because we had similar impacts in California on this, especially with our base alignment and closure, known as BRAC. The military base closures that we had at Vallejo, if you remember, when Mare Island closed down, Vallejo went bankrupt because over 60% of the people that lived in Vallejo worked at Mare Island. And then we started looking at that as being a historic district and redoing the development. Lennar that was in that, we had the downturn in our economic, had to bail out, and they're still trying to recover from that. Fort Ord sat vacant for years until it became a national monument in 2012 under Obama, 28,000 acres. A lot of federal funds were poured into that, also with the historic districts. And of course, NTC, again, blessed that we have downtown so much, but we still have vacant buildings if you go out there. In fact, the vacant buildings are yellow. The other ones have sort of the salmon color, so you can tell them, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit tomorrow. So as we look at what we're going to have, and Deborah, thank you so much for looking at all the stuff. One of the things that historic districts can do when you are a contributor, but not necessarily listed, is that you can use the California Historical Building Code. And that allows you then different alternatives in terms of how you do replacements, how you deal with the codes, and how you do that. And part of the lecture is going to be that tomorrow. But backing up to Northridge, one of the things that we found after we had a law in place that you had to go before at least contact the State Historic Preservation Office before you could do any demolitions. In other words, what you had to do is cordon off the property so that you're out of the danger of falling buildings, everything else, but you did not have the right to go ahead and demolish those buildings, especially if you're using state government funds as authorized by the Office of Emergency Services that are given to you by FEMA. So one thing that happened with Northridge, when we were talking with FEMA on this, we came up with the concept of casting the wide net and making districts. And I put districts in quote because they weren't really legal districts, but we cast this wide net. And what we said, okay, knowing now that we have not only our California Register of Historic Places, but once, and Deborah had mentioned this, once a building or a site is determined to be eligible for listing on the National Register, it automatically becomes listed on the state register. And FEMA then pays for those buildings that are damaged only if they're on a state or national register. And of course, anything that's on the national register is also automatically placed on our state register. So the local registers are out of this in terms of this disaster thing that we saw, or in fact, this right sizing, and I'm going to talk about very quickly. So casting this net, we found, okay, this may be a problem because as Deborah mentioned, one of the things about being on the California Register is you got to give your permit to do so. This didn't happen. And thousands of properties, I think at least 2,500 in mid-Los Angeles around Northridge, were saved from automatic destruction and tear down. Because the first thing that's really important in all of these areas when you're looking at this is to get back to normalcy. In other words, get the things back going. I think it's a good point. When the historic district in Santa Cruz was torn down, it took 12 years living in tents before that district ever came, or before the city ever came back to it. And I can't imagine now when I'm looking at, although I'm looking at this map, it's not in our right location, but it kind of gives you a good feel for it. I think of India or something that's in Florida, but I think when you're looking at how long this is going to take in order to get this back, and what this means for a lot of the historic districts that we have in Florida and the savings of those. So let me just finish up with this right sizing thing that we had, because I think it gives you some pretty good examples. Once we heard that HUD was going to give these billions of dollars out to cities, to mayors, to come down and tear these things down because people have left them, I wanted to show you Detroit, which I think is just one small example. Youngstown was a little bit different because they decided to Mayor Williams decided to create historic districts on the National Register so funds could be coming in. But over on the left there, it says 185 homes. Over the time that people have moved out from Detroit by losing their jobs, then what happens is these homes become vacated. And most of them are just walkaways on it. So they become vacated, people come in, they start robbing the copper out, the toilets and everything else. People try to board it. So imagine if you are trying to hold on to your neighborhood and you're there because, as going back to John Merritt, what does the neighborhood want to save for its heritage? So you're trying your best to save this, but then the house next door is becoming a place for vandalism and everything else. Property's going away. All the trees are dying and everything else. And as more and more goes down, then pretty soon you're all by yourself. And the city comes in and says, we are shutting down all electrical, water, and sewage. We cannot pay for this right now. We have open sewers and areas, so we have places for you to come into the city, and you can live in an apartment complex. And this is where, as I've said, you cannot regulate cultural values. If people want to have something going, those values cannot be regulated because they're so dear. So we heard from a gal where she comes into the kitchen, she shows a picture showing where she was when she was 4 years old. She's now 84. And all the rest of the kids on this. And that house is going away. So I get a little bit emotional from that because everybody in the room pretty much got emotional over it. So as we're talking about the districts then, and we're talking about then these place economics and how we're going to really save these things, I think the problem is that we need to understand over the time how we're going to manage change. Because as Deborah said, if you notice the historic district in the Gaslamp Quarter, when that was first put on, we did not put on any of our 1930s buildings. All the Art Deco buildings were not there because it didn't meet a 50-year threshold. And again, they weren't considered to be significant to stand by themselves. So I think, as Ken has said, these overlay zones, conservation zones, however you want to say them across the land that's happening, is really the first thing because that's your major planning tool. And as people come and go in their particular historic districts, they're going to have different attitudes on what they want to do and how they want to preserve this and how they want to interpret it. So I'm going to stop now because I'm better at trying to answer questions. And I'll let Nori come in and finish this up so we're not too late for lunch.
All right, we're going to hear from Nori Winter. Are we? Oh, good. Nori, are you still there? You are.
He's muted right now. So.
Okay, unmute him. He's there's Ken. And Nori is working on the zoning code update for Los Angeles. Okay, we're ready?
Okay, now you can hear me? Yeah.
You're good.
I'm good. All right, great. And it's just me, no slides for this session. I will have slides later this afternoon for a session on ADUs, accessory dwelling units. But to talk a little bit about some of the topics that the previous speakers have raised about how do you expedite protection in some way. We care about our neighborhood. We care about the quality of the built environment there. We want some form of protection and we want it now. And we're told we can't get it now because the survey's not done, or we can't get it now because we have to go through a formal adoption process. And people get frustrated. So what we've been working on is planners and urban designers across the country are a variety of complementary tools. We certainly work a lot with historic districts in helping to establish them and in helping writing some of the guidelines and other tools that go hand in hand with district designation. But we've been working a lot recently with some of the other planning tools that the others have alluded to. And I wanted to describe those a little bit, and particularly as they do relate to the work that we have been doing in Los Angeles, although it's also similar to some other places that we've been working in as well. It's a bit interesting. I am in, I've had the opportunity to work in California a lot, and we are presently working in Healdsburg. I'll talk more about that project later this afternoon, as well as the Los Angeles Code. We also work around the country, and I'm in Pennsylvania today, even though our offices are based in Colorado, because we're dealing with a community here, State College, Pennsylvania, the home of Pennsylvania State University, where they are struggling with, should we have historic districts or not, or are there other alternatives, and how do we deal with it? Some of the issues they're dealing with are some of the ones that we just heard alluded to, which is we have a survey, but it's 25 years old. And does that work for designation today or not? And how can we do something quickly? Change is happening, and we need the protection now. And is there some faster, simpler way, or at least are there other tools that can help us in meeting our objectives? So 2 tools that I want to talk about are base zoning and design overlays, conservation districts or community design overlays as an alternative or a complement to the concept of historic districts. I think for a long time, we've overlooked our base zoning, and in fact, have come to accept the fact that in most cases, it's an obstacle to neighborhood character, and therefore we add on lots of overlays to try to patch what doesn't work. And Los Angeles, along with many other communities, recognize that. And in the Recode LA process, we've been trying to look at how to custom tailor base zoning to be more responsive to the local built environment within some of those individual neighborhoods that Ken illustrated on his map. Right now, of those, 400 plus square miles, about 200 square miles of that, I believe, are single family zones, Ken. I think that's close to correct. And a vast majority of that land area is one single zone, R1. Now, Los Angeles has put a lot of patches on this old tire of R1 for some time with a variety of overlays that have attempted to tailor it to fit more closely the local built environment. What we've tried to do is, in a new system, bring some rationale to that. And that is by looking at different development patterns within neighborhoods, all of which have the same zoning category. They're the same color on the zoning map. But looking more closely at what are some of the development characteristics that different neighborhoods have in terms of, are they gridded? Are they curvilinear? Do they have alleys? Not alleys? What's the typical scale of building that exists there? Is there a uniform presence to the street in terms of setbacks, porches, where parking is located? Looking at about a half a dozen or so basic development variables. And out of that now have come a spectrum of new zone districts that are tailored more to the size and scale and development patterns of what has been in those neighborhoods traditionally. Now, this can apply to an area that already is an historic district. It can apply to one that has been determined to be eligible and can be put into place faster than the historic district process, potentially. And in the long term, support later historic district designation. Or if historic district designation does not occur, that new base zone at least is more supportive in terms of mass and scale that's permitted and overall orientation of buildings to the street than what you have in today's zoning. So the first concept is to think about fine-tuning and creating better choices for underlying zoning. Now, how does that get implemented? It gets implemented through the neighborhood planning process that Wayne alluded to. It requires certainly community consensus and a governmental action to enable it, but it can happen faster and it can happen for a wider range of places. And in order to do that, what we've been doing in Los Angeles is identifying what we've called a series of typologies, and that is neighborhoods that have similar development patterns where a similar new code would be helpful. And these can be scattered all over the city, but they can be identified, and generally then the fine-tuning of the mapping of those new base zones can occur at a community planning level. Now, the thing about zoning is, of course, it doesn't straddle different land use categories. So anything that's tailored to one of these, for one of these new zone districts, applies only to that zone district. What happens if you have character that straddles two different zone districts? Well, that's where the second tool can come into play, and that's the conservation district that Wayne alluded to, or a community design overlay. This is also a zoning action. It's an overlay, but it can straddle different zone districts, and it can add additional standards that don't exist in the base zone. So, for example, in Los Angeles, right now, materials are not regulated in the R1 zones, and they're not proposed to be regulated, even in the new spectrum of new R1 zone districts. But you could add that in an overlay and mandate a palette of materials for a neighborhood, or mandate that porches must be present in all new buildings. The conservation district can also, and those are just standards that are added. And so in Los Angeles right now, we're talking about two different types of conservation district. One would just be an added layer of additional design standards. Now, these are standards that can be administered by staff at the zoning counter. It does not involve a review board like a historic district commission. And it's a prescriptive measure. You either meet it or you don't, but if you do meet it, then you get your building permit. But at least there is a review of a project to assure that it meets those standards that have been tailored to the district. The second type of conservation district that we're working on would actually bring with it some design guidelines, probably only administered at a staff level, not involving a new board or commission, but would allow some discretion in terms of looking at the quality and character of development. Now, exactly how that one's to be applied is still something that we're in conversations about to figure out exactly how that will fit in, but I wanted to mention it because it is approaching the idea of a historic district, and that it does have some design review. How would the conservation districts differ from historic districts? In most places around the country where we work with them, the difference is that they are really focused on new construction and mass and scale of buildings and basic form and sometimes materials. They don't address the alterations of building fabric that preservationists are concerned about when they establish an historic district. That is, I could rip off the decorative brackets. I could change the roof material potentially, unless that's a mandated topic. But the basic form and character of the buildings in the neighborhood would still be retained. So these tools are ones that can apply in a variety of situations. One is where we don't have the information now to legitimately establish an historic district. Another is where there isn't the political support for an historic district, as Ken alluded to in some of those situations. Or an area that perhaps has not matured enough to be recognized as meeting criteria for historic significance, but still has a recognized character that people cherish and that people want to keep and in some way retain. So that's a brief overview of these tools. We'll be talking about them a little bit more specifically as they relate to accessory dwelling units later this afternoon. And just wanted to offer them as an alternative to an expedited designation process or the expedited survey process that Deborah was alluding to. That's it, folks.
Thank you, Nori. And Ken, you might want to stay online to listen, and we'll build some questions. Are there any questions from those folks of you who are here in real time? In real place, I should say.
One question.
Okay.
This question is legal, and it's so specific to Palm Springs that maybe you shouldn't spend a lot of time on it. But what are the legal realities of establishing a historic district in an Indian reservation? In Palm Springs, we have a checkerboard pattern of Indian reservations, and some of the neighborhoods that we'd like to preserve go into the reservation portion. Is it even possible?
Wayne wants to answer that question.
No, you can answer it, but I can give you some examples where tribes have not only listed districts, but they've also overlapped. And of course, in your particular case that you have with the Santa Fe Railroad and the every other square mile, is that we have been working very closely with the tribes there in terms of looking at from a planning aspect, knowing that it overlaps. But I'm not a legal person.
From a legal aspect, it's a sovereign nation, and the zoning doesn't apply. So the city can't establish a district over the tribe's objections. But what Wayne is saying is that the city and the tribe are completely free to work together to develop a plan that encompasses both.
In fact, the best person to talk to there would be Patty Garcia. She is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the tribe that oversees Palm Springs right now. And they have got probably the best GIS mapping in terms of all those particular resources that are not tribal on tribal lands.
And I think also we have a precedent at the Salton Sea where there were a number, and that whole planning effort involved a number of different tribes. So you may want to look at that also, how they negotiated.
Another legal related question for Deborah. My ears sort of pricked up when you highlighted the point that designation in and of itself is not a taking of property and that does not trigger Sequa per se. And I wanted to know if you could give us a couple case law examples that kind of document your argument.
Well, there are two separate issues there. One is that in terms of inverse condemnation or a taking under the Fifth Amendment, many times what someone says is, you're taking my property away from me because it's now going to be historic and I'm going to have to go through a procedure there to make changes. There is a lot of case law under the Fifth Amendment that holds that requiring someone to go through a process doesn't take away their property. And there's also case law in California that zoning, because zoning is classification, it's not deciding what's going to happen in a particular case, that's also not a taking. That's somewhat different from the question of Sequa. And in general, you only need to do Sequa under circumstances where you're going to have an significant adverse impact on the environment. In general, zoning requires Sequa analysis. However, if what you're doing is you're protecting the environment rather than having an adverse impact, you would either be able to do some sort of an exemption or you'd be able to do a negative declaration. But the designation itself is not, if you designate a district, I think you would certainly have an argument that you're not having an adverse significant impact on the existing environment. But they're two separate issues. They're just, when people complain about district designation, they tend to complain about takings and about the additional process of Sequa. You mean the names of the cases? Well, I would have to go back and check the California precedent. Certainly, the United States Supreme Court cases, all of the ripeness cases, like Williamson County, have held that until you get a specific decision on what you can do or not do with your property, it doesn't violate the Fifth Amendment. But you're welcome to, the OHP and the National Trust both have case law lists. The OPR has the series at CERES, and you're welcome to contact me. It's not usually in the historic preservation context, but in the zoning context.
Yeah. If you go to the Office of Historic Preservation website, you will see a lot of the cases listed there that you can download and read, and then contact whoever the lawyer was that contested that.
I was hoping that Deborah could amplify when she mentioned a process under Sequa to de- or undesignate a property. If you could amplify on that just a little.
Yes, I actually didn't bring Sequa with me. I almost never travel without it. I can look it up over lunch, but what it says is that when it designates an historic, when it gives the definition of historic resources, it identifies resources that are on the California Register, and there's some other ways of designating it. And then it says resources that are designated under a local ordinance, unless it is shown by a preponderance of the evidence that it's not historic. And so there is that they have a statement there. They don't set up a procedure, but they have a statement that says that it is possible to challenge a local designation or a local listing. You have evidence that that you're not actually historic. So it's in the statute.
Yeah, under the California under the California Register of Historic Resources, there is a process, and if you remember my mentioning North, we had we cast these nets and made these historic districts to protect them as FEMA was coming through. So one of the unique things is that since that time, we had only 6 people come in because they said, I noticed I was going to do some changes, and all of a sudden I was told that my house is listed on the California Register. And they said, we don't think so. So once we went into the history of it, we found that all of these 6 that came in were under the Northridge because they did not have the chance to have a public review on this on their own property. And in each case, the State Historic Resources Commission determined that it was one of these pieces of property that just didn't meet the criteria and removed those from those particular districts. And there is a process for that.
How do you provide conservation incentives for property owners in overlay zones? not directed to a particular person.
Well, probably Ken or Nori could. I mean, I can speak to it, but it'd probably be better if they did.
Did you get that question, Nori? Ken? I think they hear us. Either Ken or Nori, how do you provide incentives to property owners in overlay zones?
Oh, okay. Well, as Wayne was alluding to earlier, if it turns out that those properties have been identified as having being historic resources, they may be eligible for Mills Act. And so there could be incentives like that available to them. But some of the other incentives, certainly the existing building code can apply to those areas just as easily as they can to other places as they would any place else where the buildings would qualify by their age. I don't know, Ken, do you have other examples?
Yeah, so I guess I would distinguish between the conservation districts that Nori has outlined and historic preservation overlay zones or historic districts. So we have created incentives for historic districts, and so we do have a very robust Mills Act program in Los Angeles. The majority of our participants in that are contributors to our 35 HPOZs, and we do invoke the state historic building code. We have some incentives in our zoning code as well that opens up a variety of uses such as bed and breakfast and some other kind of quasi-commercial uses only for historic properties, some rights that don't exist for other properties in residential zones in the city. I think the challenge as we embrace a new conservation district tool through what Nori described through RECODE, as he indicated, that is not really about preserving character-defining features of historic buildings. And I think we'll need to make some decisions about what types of, what do we want to incentivize and how do we do that? We don't want to water down our historic preservation and designation programs because I think in some cases it could be very easy for neighborhoods to say, well, you know, we'll take the lighter hand on the regulatory side, go for a conservation district. Well, if you do that, I think you also may not get all the goodies as well as we develop a new tool, conservation districts, to address many of those neighborhoods that either there's not support for historic district or we just can't keep up with the demand for new historic districts in Los Angeles, and figure out what do we want to incentivize and how do we want to do it.
Thank you, Ken. Another question was, do transfer of development rights, maybe this is a question for Deborah to start, do transfer of development rights work in conservation districts?
Transfer of development rights, although they were originally developed in the historic context, especially in New York City, they're actually a technique that can be used anytime that you want to essentially encourage clustering or allow someone to monetize unused development capacity by selling it to someone else. So it could certainly be used in a conservation district. It may, as with other kinds of incentives, turn out to be something that is not as a policy matter as useful in a conservation district. But you can use transfer of development rights with anything from entertainment areas to wetlands to historic areas.
Yeah, we had the TDRs in the gas lamp corridor. I think we only did 2. They were extremely complicated. They took some long time. I think it's still a good concept, but it needs to be And of course, now that we have the loss of redevelopment areas, I'm not sure how effective they're going to be on that.
I would just add on that point, if you hear me, in Los Angeles, I think originally our transfer development rights program, we call it actually TFO, began very much as a preservation tool. We got away from that, I think, as an emphasis in the last decade or two, in part because the city itself has had a lot of excess density to transfer from its own convention center building in downtown. I think we're having some discussions about that currently, about expanding that program beyond downtown to other historic areas. I think the challenges are, it is complex. You do need to also find receiver sites, and in a historic setting, the controversy also is really, where does that excess density go in a way that's not detrimental to a historic district, for example, or adjacent to a historic district? This is a challenge. And do you want to focus on designated historic structures as the donor sites, or do you also want to bring in sites that may not be eligible but lend itself to neighborhood character and leave those, give those a possibility of being donor sites?
I'm going to have to sign off here, guys. This has been fun, and I'll see some of you maybe a little bit later this afternoon.
Thank you. And thank you, Ken. And we're just about, do we have any more questions, Don? Are there any more questions, last minute ones from the audience? If not, we'll adjourn.
I'm gonna just, I found that Sequa section.
Okay.
And it turns out that it is, it's actually the Sequa guidelines, 15064.5, and it says a resource included in a local register of historical resources shall be presumed to be historically or culturally significant. Public agencies must treat any such resource as significant unless the preponderance of evidence just demonstrates that it is not historically or culturally significant. So it requires someone to do a study to show it's not. And the most likely scenario is something is designated as being the last of something, and it turns out it's not. Then you might go back and say the preponderance of the evidence is that it wasn't properly designated.
Right. So with that, John?
Lunch announcement. So about 10 people, I believe, weren't able to or didn't want to pay for their lunches. So if you look at the top of your badge, there's a bunch of asterisks. If you have asterisks on your badge, that means you get a lunch today. If you don't, please don't take one, because we only ordered enough for the people who paid for them. So for those of you who paid for them, there should be some vegetarian options. If you're not vegetarian, please wait for the vegetarians to pick up theirs. And they're all sitting right there on the right.